Today on Stronger Than Reason, we talk about Alan Wilder's solo project, Recoil, and its 1992 album, Bloodline. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. So it's been a while since we talked about anything Depeche Mode. Looking back, the last episode was number 57, about songs of faith and devotion. And in general, I've talked about just 2 of their studio albums and 1 live album. That's a bit strange because DM loom large in my headspace. They blended rock and electronics, and they were similar to New Order in that respect, but with a heavy dash of goth. New Order were always a bit more major key and more rock in general and maybe more stylistically unfocused, whereas Depeche Mode, especially in its heyday, always had a distinctive sound. It was a bit dark and dramatic, and yet funky and groovy, with plenty of unrecognizable samples that seamlessly fit the music, giving it a character all its own. New Order were, dare I say, always a bit more preset-y. They relied a bit more on traditional rock instrumentation. On the other hand, there's plenty of evidence to show that Depeche Mode constantly experimented with sound, even going so far as to raid the studio kitchen for pots and pans and things they could bash and throttle. And all of this is evident on albums like Some Great Reward, Black Celebration, Music for the Masses, and Violator. And that sound, that darker element, is arguably due to the influence of one particular band member, Alan Wilder. See, the responsibilities in Depeche Mode were pretty clearly defined and had a lot to do with each member's personality. So first you had lead singer Dave Gahan, the consummate frontman. Charismatic, great voice, but not very interested in the writing or recording process. Then you had Martin Gore, songwriter extraordinaire, who came up with the lyrics and the arrangements. Third, you had Andy Fletcher, or Fletch, R.I.P., who did little musically but acted as the band's manager and was an indefatigable cheerleader for the band, keeping everyone moving in the same direction. And finally, Alan Wilder, who, while not a songwriter, worked closely with the producer Flood, especially in the late 80s and early 90s, to take Martin's homebrewed demos and craft them into international hits, reinterpreting them into the ineffable Depeche Mode sound. Sometimes that transformation was startling, as in the often told story of their biggest hit, Enjoy the Silence. Martin intended it to be a slow ballad, a breathing space on the album Violator, but Alan reimagined it as an upbeat disco number, and of course, it went on to become a cultural phenomenon. So within the machinery of DM, Alan was critical to transforming Martin's ideas into full-fledged reality. Also, it's worth pointing out that he was the only member of the band with classical training, having learned piano at a young age. In his audition, the rest of the band were in awe that he could easily play complicated parts with both hands. Alan, however, said that as a longtime piano player, nothing they threw at him was remotely complicated. He didn't consider himself to be that much better than any other similarly trained pianist. It just gives you an idea of the 2 different worlds these guys lived in at the time. So if you recall, the band had to backfill their former leader and songwriter, Vince Clarke, who dipped out following the success of their first album, 1981's Speak and Spell. Clarke decided he didn't want to deal with the band's growing success, and of course he'd go on to form a number of other successful bands, Yazoo with Alison Moyet, and then Erasure with Andy Bell, so he'd wind up facing that success sooner or later. Unfortunately, as the chief songwriter and the one who told everyone else what to do, he left a gaping hole in Depeche Mode's lineup. Fortunately, they had another world-class songwriter in Martin Gore, who stepped up. All they needed then was another pair of hands to flesh out the music in the studio and live. Thus, the search for the 4th member began. According to the story, plenty of people showed up who had the look, but who couldn't play. And then there was Alan, the only one among them with any actual skills. The trouble was, He was a bit older than the rest of the band, so he fibbed about his age and got the gig. The rest is history. He did go on to write a few tunes that appeared on subsequent albums, like Construction Time Again, but the band soon fell into their respective roles, and everyone more or less recognized that things would go more smoothly if they all kept to their own lanes, and Alan became a cohort of their stream of producers, Gareth Jones, Dave Bascombe, and eventually Flood, not only fleshing out the musical arrangements and adding depth and complexity, but also helping to define DM's distinctive sound. Alan spent his first few years with the band just sorting that out, figuring out where he fit in. By their fifth album, 1986's Black Celebration, they were coming into their own as a fully fledged act. It was poised to cross over from alternative into the rock-pop mainstream. And maybe that was the next hurdle for Alan, producing pop music. Now, in the last episode, we talked about lead singer syndrome. Now, Alan wasn't a lead singer, but he was the proper musician in the band, and he was getting some creative urges that DM as a pop band weren't fulfilling. In his mind, the extensive sampling they were doing could go in many different ways rather than just serving the pop music format of verse, chorus, verse. He knew it could be much more experimental and emotive. For the first time in history, technology was enabling artists to create music out of any sounds at all, virtually any sounds they could imagine. And while DM were on the forefront of that, Alan knew they were exploring just a tiny bit of the overall sonic landscape. So he started messing around on his own, recording things at home on his 4-track Portastudio. So do you remember 4-track recorders? I had one for a bunch of years. I want to take a minute here to explain what they are and how they work, because you may not know, I didn't back in the day. They're pretty cheap and clever, and were the only way you could produce multi-track recordings cheaply at home in the days prior to just doing it all on your computer. So I bought mine in 1995 off a friend of mine, having very little idea how it worked other than I knew it would enable some form of home recording. I bought a Fostex X26, which you see here, and what I discovered is that it simply recorded to an ordinary audio cassette, which were ubiquitous at the time. So the 4 tracks came from the fact that the audio tape had 2 stereo tracks on each side. In a normal tape player, the record and playback heads only access 2 tracks at a time, the left and right stereo tracks for the side of the tape you were on. If you wanted to get to the other 2 tracks, you had to flip the tape over. In later years, of course, manufacturers would introduce a fancy auto-reverse feature that flipped the heads for you so you didn't have to turn the tape over. But on this unit, the record and playback heads could access any of those 4 tracks. The downside, of course, was that the tapes became one-sided. So, for example, a 90-minute cassette with 2 45-minute stereo sides would only give you 45 minutes of 4-track recording. But still, it was better than nothing. The alternative was to record ordinary stereo on a boombox or something, which, of course, we all naturally did a lot while growing up. But with this thing, I could suddenly record parts asynchronously and do things like merge tracks and do final mixes. It was a huge step forward. Little did I know that in 10 years I'd be able to do all this on a computer, and it would be a hell of a lot cheaper and more intuitive. But the old Fostex filled a role for a while. I did sell it off in 2012, but I still have a box of unmixed 4-track cassettes. So Alan Wilder was doing much the same 10 years before I was, and he played some of his demos to his friend, Mute Records boss, Daniel Miller. Daniel agreed to release the recordings on the down low as a 12-inch EP, which Alan called 1+2. This came out in August 1986, a few months after DM's 5th album, Black Celebration. Now, this EP is quite short, just over half an hour, and it's composed of 2 pieces of roughly equal length. To my ears, they sound like Alan started with the mid-'80s DM sonic palette and just built long-form freestyle jams with them. My impression is that they still sound very 80s. They're kind of primitive in that way, and you would kind of expect that from 4-track recordings. So props to Alan, though, for not using Depeche Mode to market Recoil. There's really nothing on the packaging to indicate it's Depeche Mode related, except the label on the disc, which says written by A. Wilder. So, pretty cool. It's kind of Peter Saville's idea of marketing as a known secret of sorts, which he used with New Order to great success. So this was a pretty slick release, the first for Recoil, and Depeche Mode's star in the meantime continued to rise at a rapid clip. It's hard to believe that they came out with another classic album just the following year, 1987's Music for the Masses, which famously broke them in the US alternative scene, peaking at number 90 in the Billboard album chart. So go back and check out episode 7 for more on that. And now they were poised for mainstream success. A few months later, in early 1988, Alan released the second Recoil EP, Hydrology. It once again came out on the down low. Alan couldn't promote it because Depeche Mode were touring. Hydrology was more of an organic sounding record. It wasn't just sequence samples and beats. It's got 3 tracks. The opener is called Grain, and it's a lot of piano and synth washes. The second track, Stone, has a long intro and briefly becomes a Depeche Mode-like anthem and then morphs back into an ambient kind of thing. Side 2 has just one track called The Sermon that once again builds up into a throbbing bass line and occasional beats, and the outro sort of fades into a bunch of indigenous beats and chants. So it's somewhat more developed than 1+2. There's a bit more going on here musically. Both of these initial releases were fairly rare until Mute re-released them in 2007, and even later they were collected onto a single CD called Hydrology Plus 1+2. Then you might recall that Depeche Mode ended the Masses tour in front of 80,000 screaming fans at the Pasadena Rose Bowl, and then buggered over to Europe to meet up with Flood and begin recording their magnum opus, Violator, which of course cemented their fame and fortune, and I told that whole story back in episode 33. The so-called World Violation Tour extended through 1990, and their label mates and friends, those EBM favorites, Nitzer Ebb, opened for them on that tour. You might recall that a friend of mine told me how he caught this tour and how he was very enthused by Nitzer Ebb's antics, particularly those of lead singer Douglas McCarthy, who had long hair at the time and liked to headbang to the heavier numbers. Evidently, Doug and Bon were close mates with DM, and the Ebbs' new album, Showtime, had just come out in the fall, and they were already plotting and planning their next move. As it turned out, they had written a few new songs and were at something of a loss as to what direction to take the band. Now, I've talked about all 3 of their early albums in previous episodes, and you can look those up if you're interested. But the TLDR is that Nitzer Ebb had started out as fairly harsh, minimalistic, industrial dance, and they morphed over time into pop music. Showtime even has some jazz elements. So there was some question as to where they should take things next. So as a stopgap, or maybe as a hedge, they decided to release an interim EP. It had 4 tracks, each produced by a different person, and here it is. It is the As Is EP. Side note, this was one of the first CDs here I ever bought. But anyway, it's got 4 tracks on it: Family Man, Lovesick, Come Alive, and Higher, which were produced by Killing Joke's Jazz Coleman, Flood, Depeche Mode's Alan Wilder, and Paul P.K. Kendall, respectively. Now, the track that really caught my attention here was Alan's, Come Alive, because it really sounded like the best kind of dark Depeche Mode track, not like a traditional Ebb track at all. It's all moody and echoey, synth arpeggios and a big throbbing bass line with Douglas panting and shouting over top. It just sounded like nothing else on this disc. It just sounded like something else entirely, and I was into it. I mean, come on, Doug's unique vocals and Alan's arrangements and production touches. What isn't there to like? So you can imagine how chuffed I was to learn that this had been a tournament of sorts and that Alan had won. He had produced the Ebbs' 4th album with some help from Flood, so the production team that had just conquered the world with Violator was now going to bestow their goodness on one of my other favorite bands. Can't miss, right? Well, I remember the lead up to that fourth album and how funny it is to think back to the days when the biggest thing in my mind, apart from passing that calc test and paying for gas, was waiting for the new Nitzer Ebb album. But if I recall, it just kept getting delayed and delayed. However, I do remember seeing interviews with Alan and the band in the studio on 120 Minutes. And these are still online if you search for Alan Wilder, Nitzer Ebb. Dave Kendall interviews all three guys in Conch Studios. Now, in my mind, the anticipation ramped up to fever pitch, and it eventually came out as Ebbhead in late 1991. And an uglier album cover you will never see. Seriously. This thing is a travesty. It's hard to even look at, especially since Nitzer Ebb always had such clean, iconic designs in the past. And just when you think the design itself is terrible, they spray this promotional copy in one corner in the worst font imaginable and plug a UPC symbol on the front, and the whole middle part just looks like a giant bumper sticker. And then they included band photos. Like, band photos. This was unthinkable for Nitzer Ebb. And maybe an indication of how much they were changing as a band. I took it as a sign that maybe they fancied being pop stars with their faces out there, and I gotta say, I wasn't into it. And by the way, we will eventually have an episode or two devoted to album art, and I'm once again going to phone a friend for those. I cannot wait to do them. Really looking forward to it. Hoping we can get to them this summer if all goes well. I think it'll be a blast, so stay tuned for that. Meanwhile, it's hard to overstate how much this album cover turned me off. I think it affected my ability to enjoy this album. Even though the production had unmistakable signs of Alan's hand, I found the album to be overly poppy. The Nitzer Ebb I loved was harsh, minimal, direct, and simple. They spoke directly to my id. This thing, on the other hand, was very emo. Douglas was actually singing, not just barking and chanting. There were vocal melodies. There was instrumentation other than drums and bass synth. One song even had a orchestral arrangement. I don't know. In short, it sounded like a mashup of Depeche Mode and Nitzer Ebb, which on paper maybe sounded like a great deal, especially if the Depeche Mode influences were coming from Alan Wilder. But in practice, I wasn't so into it. Now, I don't want to squeeze this lemon all the way here. I'll probably do an episode down the road about As Is and Ebbhead in depth. But this story point is relevant since it established a working relationship between Alan and Douglas, as we'll see. So shortly after Ebbhead, Alan went back into his own studio. Depeche Mode were still on hiatus, or at least they were in that phase of their cycle where Martin was holed up writing songs. So the rest of the band were free to do whatever. And Alan decided it was time to once again fire up Recoil. And by the end of the spring term of 92, this came out, their third release, a full 50-minute album, Bloodline. Now, right away, you have to appreciate this cover. It's a far cry from the sheer blasphemy of Ebbhead. This is clean, understated, and tasteful. No neon colors, UPC codes, headshots, or marketing text. And second, I love the visual pun. Since this is a photo of someone with bloodlines scratched onto their back, it's clever without being too clever, and I love the muted black and white. Interestingly, when you flip it over, you have the 5+6 here. So this album follows right along from 1+2 and Hydrology, which was 3+4. And as you can see, this has not 2 or 3, but 7 songs, which means it's nearly double the length of each of the previous releases. Now, I did not run out and buy this right away. In fact, for a long time, I had only heard one song off this record, the lead-off track, Faith Healer, on MTV. So when did I eventually get this? I recall that it came to me in a whole lot of CDs that someone gave me, and I can't remember who it was or when exactly, but I seem to recall that it was someone older than me, maybe a former bandmate. and that this was the only CD in the whole bunch I was remotely interested in. I think I just donated the rest. I'm also sure that it was quite a while after the initial release. I would guess that I got this maybe 15 years or so ago. But once I had it, I promptly ripped it right to my iPod and finally sat down to give this album a deep listen. And I really dug it. Unlike Ebbhead, which was, I thought, trying too hard to be poppy and be everything to everyone, in my opinion, this album was much cleaner and really impressed me. So let's go track by track. First up is Faith Healer, which is actually a straightforward cover of a song by the sensational Alex Harvey Band. The original is on their 1973 album Next. This version features great vocals by Douglas. Recoil did a video for this, which was a lot of fun. It's mostly Douglas posing out with creepy yellow contact lenses and Alan sitting in a room somewhere reading a book alongside a chicken and a king snake, as you do. So listening to the original, you can see why Alan would want to cover it. It's dark, it's dramatic, with some orchestral type sounds, and it's very dynamic, going very loud and very quiet and then back again. In introducing vocalists here, Alan necessarily introduces lyrical themes, and this song, with its dark religious imagery, immediately sets the tone. This is a bit more what I imagine Ebbhead would be like. This is much more in the vein of Come Alive than anything on that album. Not so aggressive as it is sultry and suggestive. It's just a great opening track, and as we'll see, it establishes the pattern of Alan inviting different vocalists to do their thing on most of these tracks. The next song is a bit special. It's called Electro Blues for Booker White. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, Booker T. Washington White, better known as Booker, was an American bluesman from the Mississippi Delta. He was the real deal. He had an amazing career that I encourage you to check out, but he never met Alan Wilder and had never heard of Depeche Mode because White died in 1977 when Alan was just a teenager. This track is notable in that it was maybe the first alternative track that mined old African-American blues recordings for vocals, something that electronic rock musician Moby would later parlay into an entire career. So let's take a moment to think this through. On one hand, right on, all artists sampling, all artists borrow from what came before. Sampling just took the same idea to new, more literal levels, but in reality it was nothing new. So it's perfectly okay for Alan Wilder to pull vocal recordings of this old bluesman and reframe them, repackage them into something new and exciting that spoke to a new generation of listeners. After all, Alan was giving Booker White new relevance. Recoil listeners were now more likely to seek out White's earlier work since there was now a connection to something they knew and liked. So that's one point of view. Another point of view is, hang on a minute, here we've got some young white millionaire using the voice of a long-dead black man, slapping an old recording on some new record in order to do what exactly? Add some street cred, some cultural flavor. Cultural appropriation wasn't a buzzword in the early 90s, but would later become controversial, especially with respect to Moby and his album Play that sampled so many long-gone black voices. In other words, is this just rich, entitled white people using black culture to spice up their art? So you get the point of that perspective. Now, I'm pretty sure that Recoil was far enough under the radar that it didn't engender these sorts of discussions at the time. But Play certainly did, especially given Moby's other controversial behaviors, which would probably take up an episode in themselves. In retrospect, though, we can draw a clear line from the audio resurrection of Electro Blues for Booker White to Play and Moby's subsequent albums, which, despite your opinion of him, were extraordinarily successful both commercially and critically. So for what it's worth, this track may have indeed influenced Moby since he appears as a vocalist later on this record. So he was well aware of this track and its implications. Now, what I just laid out were two pretty opposite positions, and I'm not really arguing for either one. I'm a reasonable guy. I think the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. For me, it really comes down to one thing. Did Booka White's estate get paid? And if you look carefully at the liner notes on Bloodline, you'll see that Alan does indeed credit the song to him and Booka White. So yes, he got credit and publishing on this track. And as long as that happened, in my mind, it's all good. You have to give credit. You have to give compensation. Apart from that, this is a really cool track, and it also points to where Recoil would go with their as of now final album, 2007's Subhuman, where they would employ an actual, living, breathing bluesman to sing and play guitar. I think it's interesting that Alan had this interest in the blues and sought to incorporate it into what is otherwise a fairly experimental project. Lord knows I haven't talked much about the blues on this show, but you can bet that sooner or later I'll devote an episode to the Blues Brothers. So let's move on. Track 3 is an instrumental, the first of two. It's called The Defector. It's a very beat-heavy thing, occasionally funky. It does have some vocoded vocals, so there's a bit of a focus, but mostly this tune has a very complex arrangement, and it never really gets boring despite being over 8 minutes long. And side note, all of these tunes are on the long side. The shortest comes in at 6 minutes, which is more than double the length of any song meant for radio. So Alan's really giving his tracks here a lot of time to breathe. But to me, The Defector sounds like a cool upbeat track you'd hear in the closing credits of a really good film. You know, something to send you on your way with a bit of zip in your step. There's just something cinematic and big about it. It's just a really cool sounding track. And then that goes into track 4, Edge to Life. This time featuring one of my favorites on the mic, Tony Halliday of Curve, who of course in 1992 was one of the hippest alternative vocalists around, coming off Curve's massive debut LP, Doppelganger, which I'll discuss at some point. I did talk about Curve's early work in episode 62. On Edge to Life, Tony is fairly deep in the mix. She's mostly whispering her vocals, and you only really know it's her when she raises the volume a little bit. Also, Alan freely uses cut-up vocal samples of her here in addition to full takes, so the overall impression is that she's used more for texture on this song than as a focal point, which is kind of unusual for a vocalist. So this is not a pop song. I think, though, it's got a great beat, it's very melodic, but it doesn't really follow the standard pop structure. Tony is not singing verses and choruses here, but overall a very interesting song. Next up is Curse, which features Moby. I got to do a Moby episode sometime. I think I probably know more about him from reading his memoirs than I do from listening to his music. He's a guy who's made some strange choices in life. Some I don't agree with, some I do, though I do think he definitely has musical talent. On Curse, he's rapping over some mid-tempo beats. To me, this song has some very KMFDM-ish sounds and samples. In fact, there's one synth bit here that sounds exactly like the beginning of KMFDM's song Ultra from their Nile album. But I know it can't be because Bloodline came out in 92 and Nile came out in 95, and I'm pretty sure the synth on Ultra isn't just a sample, so maybe it's a coincidence, but Curse definitely has a KMFDM-y flavor, which I don't think is a bad thing at all. It's also got some fairly annoying televangelist samples, which were all the rage in the 80s and 90s. I think any industrial or dark ambient act worth its salt had to sprinkle these into the mix. Kind of like MSG. It's an overall flavor enhancer. That was the legacy of Welcome to Paradise. So in that aspect, at least, this song isn't tremendously original, but the production is great, and Alan keeps the arrangement moving along, so it never gets boring either. And the end of this track is a strange ambient interlude that's clearly separate from the rest of Curse. It's kind of reminiscent of the similar interludes on most DM albums. And then we have the title track Bloodline, which also features Tony Halliday. On this one, she's much more upfront, singing a more traditional lead vocal with harmonies. If it isn't clear, I think Tony is a fantastic frontwoman. She's got a unique and amazing voice. She's not only immediately recognizable, but she established or at least strongly reinforce the trope of the noisy alternative rock act with a smooth and sultry female vocalist. Many women would carry that baton into the future, from Garbage's Shirley Manson in the 90s up through the present day with Envy of Nuns' Maya Wynn. But Tony was maybe the first with Curve to parlay that formula to such success. Anyway, Bloodline is a cool showcase for her talents, differing from Curve only in production, since it lacks Curve's signature wall of sound and, of course, Dean Garcia's patented big fat bass. In fact, I'm not really hearing any guitar on any of the tracks here on Bloodline. The mid-range is all just synth and samples, but, with Alan at the helm, it sounds pretty great. Bloodline, I think, is a worthy tune. And then the closer, Freeze. This is another instrumental, and you might think it's just another synthorama, but it has quite a bit of piano on it, and piano is, of course, Alan's main instrument. Some of my favorite Depeche Mode B-sides were the ones where he just played piano. I remember listening to Depeche Mode with a buddy once when he played the single for Little 15, and I was surprised that the sleeve listed Sonata number 14 in C-sharp major, the Moonlight Sonata, as a track. And indeed, it was a straightforward performance of the classic Beethoven piece on piano. Evidently, Alan was just messing with it in the studio. Martin was impressed enough to surreptitiously record it and release it on the single, which is pretty impressive. And of course, Alan always played piano live to Somebody, among other songs. So yeah, talented piano player, and it's nice to hear some of that on Freeze. And that's the album. 7 tracks, 50-odd minutes, and some of those minutes are indeed odd. It's a disc that's full of surprises, but also is eminently listenable. Something I can't say about most experimental music. I think it's incredibly easy to make experimental music that is unlistenable or at least uninteresting. And I've made more than my share of unlistenable experimental music myself, so I know what I'm talking about. That's not what Alan Wilder was doing with Recoil. With him, it was always an engaging experience. It was never boring. So what happened next? Well, when this disc came out, with a minimum of fanfare other than the Faith Healer video, which I think did come out as a single too on various formats, all of which just had remixes. It didn't have any B-sides or extra tracks. But after that disc came out, Depeche Mode reconvened and rolled right into the dizzying highs and terrifying lows of their next album, Songs of Faith and Devotion, which I described in detail in episode 57. That resulted, of course, in Alan's departure from Depeche Mode due to the imbalance, in his opinion, between workload and credit. And also, I think he just generally outgrew the idea of being in a rock band, which is something his bandmates have not yet faced up to despite now hitting retirement age. I do remember reading about Alan leaving at the time. As I recall, I heard about it on Usenet. Having dialed into my Unix shell account with my trusty 14.4 modem, the good old days, and I read his press release on my amber screen monitor. And I figured, well, that's the end of an era. I do still love me some Depeche Mode, but it was never the same after Alan left. I never saw them live again, and to me, their subsequent albums would have diminishing returns. He would do the occasional odd job with his former band, like remixing In Chains off 2008's Sounds of the Universe. That was excellent. And, of course, joining them on stage to once again back Martin on Somebody in 2010. But that was it. True to his word, he'd never fully rejoin. He did, however, produce 3 more studio albums as Recoil, Unsound Methods in 1997, Liquid in 2000, and Subhuman in 2007. I did own Unsound Methods for some time, but I do not now. I have little memory of it, and I'm not sure what happened to it, alas. I also bought Subhuman digitally, and I'm favorably impressed enough to potentially talk about it in the future. Very unusual and interesting record. But I have never listened to Liquid. I have no idea what's on it. However, the cover art is alarmingly similar to Massive Attack's 100th Window, For what it's worth, Liquid came out 3 years prior, so take that, Massive Attack. In 2010, Alan produced a Recoil compilation album called Selected and toured sporadically over the next couple years, having not concerts so much as DJ-type events where he and PK would live mix Recoil and Depeche Mode. These so-called Strange Hours were duly filmed and presented as a DVD in 2012. And that, folks, is where Alan Wilder has left things. Since then, he has generally dropped out of public view. One hopes he's living happily somewhere and doing well. So why do I love Bloodline? Well, it's the first Recoil disc that goes beyond mere experimentalism by introducing vocals. And when you introduce a vocalist, suddenly the music is far more relatable. It gives the listener a focal point. I have a theory that simply adding a vocal to any track shifts the listener's attention a great deal, maybe as much as 80% to the vocal. Why? Because as social creatures, we're wired to be interested in what someone else is saying. We're not just listening to their words and message, we're also listening to their inflections, their tone, and their cadence. We're reading the lines, and we're reading in between the lines. We're unique among the apes in that we have a special region of the brain for doing all this work. Broca's area. That's the region devoted to language. All this processing takes up a good bit of mental bandwidth, which is why the music mostly goes out the window as soon as you have a singer. With this album, Alan took the big step of redefining Recoil as a vocal band, not with him as the singer, but with an ever-changing roster of guests. This made it different from, but still competitive with, his day job in that Recoil could now engage listeners in that linguistic level, just like Depeche Mode. The difference, maybe, was that he had no plans to tour with Recoil as a traditional band, so he wasn't constrained in having a single vocalist. It was a formula that worked for him artistically, bringing in a bunch of different collaborators and added a lot of flavors to the stew, and it helped him find inspiration in different places. Bloodline was the first step in that direction. I have a lot of respect for Alan's accomplishments in Depeche Mode and for his talent as a musician and a sound designer. I do think his departure forever diminished Depeche Mode. The fact that they tried to replace him with a whole team of producers should indicate how important he was. That, and despite bringing in so many others, it was still never really the same. The frame was broken, you might say, and no amount of construction time would put it back together. Haha. Anyway, Bloodline was a big step in Alan staking out his own artistic territory. It's a statement of intent, a herald of things to come, and it does its job well. It included some of my favorite artists of that era, so what's not to love? Nothing. So that's why I love it. Well, there you have it, folks. Recoil's Bloodline, the first proper album from the first and arguably the most successful Depeche Mode side project. And it will probably remain so at least until Mute Records decides to release Fletch's Toast Hawaii album, and that's a Depeche Mode deep cut right there. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason either on YouTube or on the podcast platform of your choice. The show that describes an ant system algorithm for the problem of finding the maximum click in a given graph. In the algorithm, each ant has only local knowledge of the graph, but working together, they induce a candidate set of vertices from which a click can be constructed. For 22 of the 30 graphs tested, Stronger Than Reason found the optimal solution, but for the remaining graphs, Stronger Than Reason produced solutions that are within 16% of the optimal. The performance of Stronger Than Reason is therefore slightly better than other existing podcasts. As always, I thank you for listening, and until next time, stay strong.